Okay, here we are continuing on with the Rangeland Principles class here at the University of Idaho. Today we're going to talk about grazing methods or systems. I'm joined today by Dr. April Hewlett. As you know, we've been going through this class together for nearly the whole semester.
Yes, yeah.
And we're in. So I just want to clarify, when April and I took these classes when we were in school, we call these grazing systems. That's probably what you heard it called, yeah. But today, a better term would be grazing methods, because systems makes you think they're really structured and really, detailed and have to follow these dates. But methods is a more approach to it. So we're going to talk about grazing systems and methods, but mostly thinking about the flexibility. So here are some basic principles of grazing methods on rangeland. Okay, first of all, what can these grazing methods do for you? Well, one of the things that we discovered 70 years ago, when we first started applying grazing systems and methods on the range, was that they can really help you improve vegetation community. They can, get the healthy plants healthier because they're not always being grazed down, and get rid of some of the weeds and stuff. So that kind of improvement, or what you might even think of as a restoration, can happen because of grazing methods. It also can improve the uniformity of use if you have animals that are using one part of the pasture more than another. By putting some fences up and using pastures at different times, concentrating animals in some pastures, you can improve the uniformity of grazing. We also commonly use grazing systems to stabilize the forage supply throughout the season. So what I mean by that is that if we want to save some forage for later in the season, for example, we would just want to keep that there and not graze it, so that that's always available. So that would be stabilizing the forage supply. You can also use grazing systems to improve forage quality, because animals will tend, if you can use the animals to graze down the old stuff, the dead material, then the green material will come up, and that will improve forage quality. So you could have a system, and we'll show some that where you go back to the green material later in the year. But also, I think about wildlife too, because I've heard a lot of people say that the deer don't like being with the cows because they just don't like being with them. Well, actually, what the deer are probably doing, they're just following the cows because they want that green material. Have you heard that too, April? Yeah. That's the way it is. But think about almost any grazing function or process on rangelands. It could be affected by a grazing method, such as protecting watersheds or enhancing wildlife habitat. So they're really powerful tools on pastures. Okay, before we go any further, we have to distinguish between some terms. For example, like a grazing system, that is just a planned effort to leave some areas that are used or unused throughout the season. So the key is the planning. And now, April, what is a grazing period?
So a grazing period is going to be the season or the number of days that you graze a certain pasture. Season not being growing season, but rather a time event.
Right. We're talking about grazing systems. We're talking about that grazing period.
Yeah.
Another term that we have to use in grazing methods is a deferment. So a deferment is when you don't graze until after the plant produces seeds, because it's kind of sensitive to grazing up to that point. And that's different than a rest, which is...
Yeah, so the rest is the period of non-grazing for a full year. And oftentimes this is confused with deferred. But deferred, again, is just waiting until that key forage sets seed, versus resting is really not utilizing that pasture for a complete year.
So here's a diagram that describes what April and I just said. So the deferment is you'd start with grazing sometime early in the season, probably about green up, and then you would not have grazing in a pasture until after seed set. That would be a deferment. Whereas the rest would be just not grazing that pasture for the whole year. We'll talk about grazing methods that have one or two of those approaches to them. Another term that we have to distinguish between is a grazing season versus a growing season. And April already talked a little bit about this, whereas a grazing season is when you're at that period of grazing that you're going to actually use the property, the management unit, the pasture. Whereas a growing season could be year long. It's whenever the grass is green to begin to be grazed to when it's dormant. Okay, now that still varies a little. Like when we use the plants, when we are on rangelands, we tend to think of the growing season being there, but then we would graze beyond the growing season. So we would usually graze into dormancy. So our grazing period is probably longer than the growing season. In introduced pastures, tame pastures, we generally match those two things up because we're trying to really use the grass to create forage. So grazing season and growing season are often the same in pastures. So it's this minor point, but just maybe the take-home message is that we tend to use rangelands well beyond the growing season. Okay, Now let's go through some of the basic systems. There are a ton. There's thousands of systems. There's many differences on these themes, but we're going to give you the main elements. So the easiest, the first one that we always start with is continuous grazing, and that's when you have a whole pasture like is on this graph, and you graze the whole area for the whole season with your one herd of cattle or sheep or goats. That's continuous grazing. And with each of these methods, we're going to focus on some of the pros and cons. So some of the pros for the continuous grazing include that it's really simple, very low input. Just you got to have a fence around the property, and that's the minimum of what you have to have. It's also really good for animal performance because animals are getting whatever they want any time of year. So they're choosing, and animals are pretty good at choosing what's good for them and what makes them fat. They're designed to do that. So this system, although it looks kind of like not very high tech, it's actually really good for animal performance. But there's some downsides to it, such as
Yes, on the flip side, if you can always choose what you're going to eat, then oftentimes you're going to create areas that are excessively used or become degraded. I mean, I like to think about it just being like if you're a kid and you're going and
Yeah.
you get the choice to choose what you have for dinner every night, are you going to choose broccoli or ice cream? You know, they're going to just excessively choose one or the other. And it's important when you look at this map, you can see the stream that runs through. And just thinking about the ecology of the landscape, where are you going to have the most green plants, the highest protein yields? It's going to be next to the stream. So you can start to see degradation where we don't want degradation on our rangelands.
Yeah, so those riparian areas like that can be certainly a problem. So let's just make the next level of a system that's just a little bit more difficult. And that would be what we call the deferred rotation system. So with a deferred rotation, you have to have at least 2 pastures, but you can have quite a few. Here's just a 3-pasture deferred rotation. And what a deferred rotation system is when you do not graze at least 1 pasture until after seed set. In other words, you defer at least 1 pasture. And the rotating is that deferment. So you'll see here on year 1, that top set of bars, we grazed the north pasture, and then we went to the south pasture, and then we went to the upland pasture, which means that upland pasture had a deferment. The next year, we started in the south pasture, went to the upland, and then we grazed the north pasture, meaning the north pasture had the deferment. And finally, we deferred the south pasture until the fall. So that deferment is rotating among those 3 points. So this is a really good system for a number of reasons. One of the real pros about it is that you have at least one of those pastures that gets deferred, so it usually leads to some improvement, especially of those pastures that are not grazed. So finally, you're making sure that there's one pasture that can get to seed set and not have grazing as part of it. There are some downsides, though.
The flip side, unlike our continuous grazing, now the animals don't have the choice to get any plant or any place they want to go. There are some restrictions that are implemented usually through fencing, which again can be another con because it's expensive to put up your fencing and to manage that and to move them from pasture to pasture over the year.
Yeah, so we've done a lot of studies on this, and so we know that anytime you restrict animals' choices, they won't gain as much. But this is not much of a restriction.
Yeah.
So in the hundreds of studies that have been done, we hardly ever see very much of a difference in animal performance. A little bit. So it's a possibility when anytime you restrict an animal's choices, you can reduce their performance. But this one's still pretty good.
It's good, and it gives your ecosystem a chance to recover.
Yeah.
Those plants. So
if you're willing to pay for the fence.
Yep, if you're willing to do the fence and the management, which is still fairly minimal in this situation.
Okay, now let's go to the next level. We got another 3 pastures here. And in this case, we're going to do a rest rotation. So we do not graze at least 1 pasture for a whole year. We just rest it. And we're going to rotate that rest among the pastures. So in the first year, that first top set of bars there, we're going to graze the spring pasture. And then we're going to move west into the hill pasture. And we're not going to graze the creek pasture. In year 2, we are going to start in the creek pasture and then move to the spring pasture and not graze the hill pasture. And then in year 3, we're going to rest the spring pasture all year round. Okay, so there are some pros and cons to this. One of the pros is that we really often see range improvement because we're giving one of those pastures a rest for the whole year. So it has the ability to produce seeds and then let the seeds fall on the ground, and it really gets a whole rest. And this is especially important for riparian areas because riparian areas are sensitive in the spring because the soil can be compacted. They're also sensitive in the fall because those shrubs can be eaten. And in the middle of summer, when it's still green and the uplands are getting dry, then it's attractive. So riparian areas have sort of these 3 periods of when they can be damaged. And this way, they get a rest that protects them all of those 3 seasons. So that's one good thing.
So some of the negatives that might come with rest rotation is that you do have to concentrate your animals in the other pastures. So there's typically more animals or higher stocking rates in those pastures while that other one is resting. And then the other one is that you're going into areas that haven't been grazed in that past year. And so you can have that buildup of that dormant season or that dry grass mixed with the new grass, which just has less protein or nutrients for the animal.
Yeah, so this system was called the Hormé system because Hormé was a researcher from the Forest Service. I think he was from California, and he came to Idaho and Oregon. And you'll see a lot of these 3 pasture rest rotation systems still today that Hormé himself set up. And they are designed for plants because they're designed for the plant to get to seed set, drop those seeds, and then have the livestock come in the next year and push those seeds into the ground, and then give them a rest so that those seeds can come up. So this is really designed to set seed, plant seeds, and let the grasses come up. It is not designed for animal performance because we're concentrating animals in 2 out of our 3 pastures, and then every time we move them to a pasture that hasn't been grazed for a while. So that's it's not terrible for livestock production, but it's pretty good for range protection. It's kind of a pro and a con there. Okay, another system that I don't know what to call this. This method of grazing where you have a lot of pastures and you graze them more than 1 time per year goes by a term. Short duration would be one. I've heard it called high intensity, low frequency, management intensive, quick rotation. There's several names for this, but the idea is the same. That you take your ranch and you divide it into several pastures and you graze each pasture for a very short time. And you make sure that each of those pastures is grazed at least twice a year. So here's the graph is that we might move through our pastures pretty quickly, just 15 or 20 days, and then we'll come back to that first pasture, pasture A. We start in January and we come back in May. Okay, so you can see that this is a full year. That's 12 months. So these systems work really well if you have 12 months of grazing. So they tend to work better in places with when you have really long grazing systems, but you can use them in Idaho or Oregon too. Anytime you come back to a pasture, that's the key. Okay, there's some advantages to coming back onto a pasture more than once per year, and that is that the stocking rates are higher because you have a lot of pastures and you're concentrating animals, but that means they have to eat all the plants. We talked about this in one of the classes called they have to clean their plate. Before they get to go to another pasture, they got to eat all the plants. So that's because the plants of higher quality that normally would get eaten and none of their neighbors would get eaten, now everybody gets hit. So everyone is equally grazed. And so then we tend to see a situation where those plants that are of higher, that are liked more, they get damaged as much as others. So then everybody comes back the same. The other advantage is when you come back to that pasture the second time around, you've grazed it once already, so it's all going to be fresh, green, leafy material. So that can be really good for livestock, for the livestock quality, the forage quality. So range conditions sometimes improves because all plants are grazed, but not always because some plants are more sensitive to grazing. So it just takes the manager's knowledge to decide if it's working or not.
Yeah, one of the places we've really tried to use this is when we have annual grasslands, and hitting them a little bit more than we would regularly to really try to knock back those annuals. And they seem to do pretty well, or the cows, I guess, do okay in these systems. And we can reduce some of our annual grasses by doing the short duration or high intensity grazing. But yeah, and just like you mentioned, I mean, the cows, you have to eat everything, or the livestock has to eat everything. So they can't be selective, whether that's good or bad. So we can kind of decide. But yeah,
depending on the system, sometimes that can lead to improvement because all the plants are getting eaten back. And sometimes it can be good for the cows or not. But one interesting thing about this is a lot of times people say that they think this is stressful on the cows because they're just in these small areas and they get moved around. But that actually isn't true. Science tells us that animals get very used to being in those situations, and they're not herded from pasture to pasture. You just open the gate. The cows, the people that I know that have this say, yeah, the cows, they're waiting at the gate when it's time to move. It's like it's kind of like, when your hair is too long, it's time for a haircut. Your hair is too long. It's like these cows are in those pastures and they go, man, the grass is short. We need to go to the next pasture.
Yeah.
So even though it seems like it's really intense management, it actually can be pretty easy, except for keeping those fences up.
Yeah.
So this is one that I have a friend of mine, Dr. Ken Sanders. When I first started learning from him, he says, Karen, I've seen every one of these systems work and every one fail. And this one, you can fail in a hurry, or it can work in a hurry.
It's just always important to know what your plans are. And I think you can select a good grazing system or method depending on that.
So here's a good example of how, if you know what your plants are, and if you're in a situation like we are in Idaho, where we have low elevation and high elevation, we can use this seasonal suitability grazing system. And so seasonal suitability is when we're moving livestock to different ranges. So we start out in the winter range. This is historic in Idaho, like down in the Oahes and around the Snake River, we'd had winter range, especially in the Salt Desert where we had shrubs that were good in the winter. And then we'd move to those kind of sagebrush benchlands, that's spring, fall, and then we move up to the summer range. So another term for this is following the green. And it's an old system, but it can really have some advantages. So some of the pros on this system is that animals are always eating green stuff. So it tends to be, they can be very productive, very high growth and very high performance. The plants are grazed mostly earlier in the seed set before they're flowering and setting seed. So it can be pretty good on them. Remember, plants can recover from grazing as long as they have the resources to recover. So when they're grazed earlier in the season, it's not so bad. So it can be pretty light impact on the plants, but there are some downsides.
Yeah, this is kind of the traditional grazing system or method that my family uses, but it does take a little bit more herd management. It seems like we're out there quite a bit pushing them as we follow up the green. And like it says, the summer range may not always get deferred. And it kind of depends on your weather, right? From year to year and what the timing's going to be.
People like your family, you probably do this, where what they tend to do is they might graze up the west side of some mountain and down the east. Yep. And next year they turn it around. They graze up the east and down the west.
Yeah.
So you tend to have deferment. So I don't see a lot of damage to areas in these, except if you camp out on those mountain meadows at the top.
Right. And typically try not to get up to those until later in the season, and then the season pushes you back down. So
yeah, that's right. The snow will bring it down. So the old system still used a lot today, because although it does take high management, it's really good on the plants and the animals. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of little methods that fit in this, what we would call decisional or management intensive grazing. Most of these are where you have one herd and you have multiple pastures, but there's some different ways that you might decide to move animals. One is that you might make a decision based on the management considerations, such as, is there forage in this pasture? Is the water still available? What about cover for calving or lambing? Or even about other wildlife that might be in the pasture? That might be a part of the decision. Or if we need to facilitate some practice like haying or prescribed fire or restoration practice. So these systems are, even though they're not really a system, they're the most common thing, I think, throughout the West and certainly the world. They can be highly successful. It just depends on the manager.
Yeah, and even though a lot of managers will use these other methods that we've discussed, it almost goes back to kind of this one herd mentality, and they'll tweak it depending on their experience, because they know they have a good sense of what's happening on the landscape and can kind of adjust according to their needs.
Yeah, so even though this is what we call decisional, those other ones also have a lot of decisions that people make. Okay, here's an example then of a couple of systems that are in this decisional or management intensive, but they have a few more parameters. The first is the best pasture method. And this is where you move animals to the pasture that has the best forage at any one time. And if you have a big enough ranch and you're in an area with some variable precipitation, you can have a situation where on the ranch, maybe the northwest pasture will get a bunch of rain and the southwest won't get any. So you're going to have a difference in forage from time to time. And so this system was designed in those arid areas where rain will fall in one place and not another. And therefore every month or so, you've got to decide where to put the cows based on where the forage is, because the vegetation or because the plants are there or not. So it was most developed in the Southwest. I grew up in the Northern Plains, and we use a lot of complementary systems there. They're designed where you you do it, you know you're not going to have enough forage for high enough quality all year. So you cultivate or you plant an improved pasture to either have early spring grazing or late season grazing. So you might do something like plant crested wheatgrass that gets greener earlier and can handle grazing better than the native range, and you'd go to that, and that would be your spring pasture. You'd hold off grazing on the native range and go there. And then in the fall, you might have another pasture that you planted to maybe an annual plant or even a cover crop like beets or something that the animals will eat those. Turnips or something. My dad used to use turnips as his complementary pasture in the fall because then the cattle would actually eat those turnips. We also use like ryegrasses or something that will stick up above the snow. So the idea here is that you're going to take some of your ranch and you're going to plant these forage resources when your native range doesn't have enough forage. That would be a complementary system. And then you might describe this one, April. This is the one you said you guys have used for years.
Yes, we just talked about this one kind of. We did, but basically just moving the livestock into the different range depending on the different growth patterns of that vegetation. So where I grew up, we had monsoonal rains, and that dictated some of the areas that we could move. So depending on those conditions and those patterns of growth, we could move our livestock.
Yeah, all these decisional systems. Okay, system's best. Well, I went to school thinking I'm going to figure out what the very best system is, and it turns out there is no silver bullet. Every system will work everywhere sometimes, depending on the manager. So don't go through life thinking there is just this one silver bullet system, and we need to find that. There are thousands of systems, thousands of variations on the themes, and all of them need to be flexible because of unexpected disturbances like rain or fire or weeds, and they also need to account for the abilities of the managers. So don't go thinking that there's just one system that works all the time. The no silver bullet. Success of the system depends on.
Yeah, so like we said, the type of the forage, the terrain. You have to consider how your cattle or livestock are going to be distributed on the pasture, different weather patterns, the skills of the managers. All of those things are going to go into planning the best grazing system.
But no matter the system, there's something you got to get. You got to get the right stocking rate.
Yep, always.
And you got to use an animal that's suited for the land. And you've got to pay attention to distribution problems that you might have.
Yep.
So all of those have to happen no matter what system you're working with. Okay, so here's a video that I'm going to give you a chance to look at. And this video is from Australia. But I think you're going to be surprised how similar it sounds to the kinds of things that we have in Idaho or the Northwest. The challenges that this rancher is facing are much like ours. Okay, here's some questions for the end. If you think you know what all this material is, kind of test your knowledge. You should be able to answer all of these. And again, this is Karen Launchbaugh and
April Hewitt.
And we were happy to join you today to talk about grazing methods.